I take that introduction in the no pressure category. Giving all praise to God, honor to Reverend Livingston, all of the leaders of this grand congregation. We are grateful for the opportunity to share and for the gifts of ministry that have already been shared through the voices of these magnificent choirs across generation, as we have heard their voices and as they have been centered in the context of this worship experience. I do want to, as we begin, just very briefly acknowledge and appreciate the work and bring you greetings on behalf of the staff, the volunteers, the board members across the nation of the Children's Defense Fund. And many of them are online, watching, engaging, along with my family in St. Louis and in Dallas. So hi to my kids and to my wife. And also one of our team members who is here, who has worked most intimately with our Children's Sabbath this year, Mr. Glenn Vincent Jr., a national organizer for faith communities, is here with us in New York. So thank you very much, Glenn. I also want the occasion to express public gratitude to one of our board members who is local to the area, Mr. George Gresham, the president of SEIU's 1199, who extended to us hospitality yesterday through his team, and principally Mr. Jeffrey Hand, who leads security there at their new offices, to invite us in and teach us more about the struggles in which they have engaged, and in many cases with many of you. So we extend our gratitude and thanks to them for their hospitality as we do with you. And I am a preacher, and I have an irresistible urge to preach. So I invite your attention to this gospel reading from the 10th chapter of Mark, verses 35 through 45. And I will privilege the first 5 passages from verses 35 through 40 with your prayers, reflecting on the topic seen and not heard, raising a nation by listening to children. Seen and not heard. If you will allow me a point of personal privilege this morning, Riverside, I have come to apologize to Paw. Paw is my grandfather. His name is R.L. Turner. I learned his name was R.L. Turner once I was about 17 years old. He was always just Paw. Paw, I thought, originated the phrase. Paw, I thought, came up with the words, children should be seen and not heard. I thought it, even though as I prepare for moments of reflection like this, I could not put my finger on a time when he actually said it. I attributed it to Paw because we have those people in our lives who they bring to mind certain kinds of things. They bring to mind certain words, and so we attribute things to them even if they didn't say it. A great reflection from the black church pulpit. I can't remember who it was. Must have been Gardner Taylor. Something powerful about children in America, and I can't exactly locate it, had to be Marion Wright Edelman. And so in my life, I came over time, because he so lived out the spirit of the thing, that Paw must have been the person who came up with the phrase and popularized the sentiment that children should be seen and not heard. Paw worked hard as a cook. He was a retired member of the armed forces. He served our country valiantly. He was originally from East Texas, moved to Dallas, where I grew up, and spent long days at Highland Park Cafeteria. Highland Park may sound familiar. It's the neighborhood from which we got the only pair of president and vice president who were really from the same state, just one of them registered to vote in Wyoming so they could run together. Highland Park, where the Bushes and the Cheneys went back and forth and ate. And there in the kitchens in Highland Park was my pawpaw, R.L. Turner. On the other side of Highland Park, there were children like me who went to work with Momo. Yes, if you have a pawpaw, you have to have a Momo. Momo, Laureen Turner. We rode the DART bus with her, Dallas Area Rapid Transit. During the summer times when we were out of school, we rode across town to Highland Park, that area where the Bushes and the Cheneys lived, that area where my grandmother would clean homes. As my mother termed her, the most educated domestic in the state of Texas with her degree from Jarvis Christian College. She cleaned the homes in North Dallas and Highland Park, and we ran around when we needed to be with her, trying not to be seen by the homeowners, while Pawpaw cooked for them when they went out to lunch. And by the time they came home from working in Highland Park, Pawpaw just wanted to sit in the middle of the living room and watch television. And I know this will sound odd to the children in the room, but there was no thing called a remote control, except this thing called grandchildren. And Pawpaw called upon us when he needed someone to change the channel, and Pawpaw called upon us when he needed some water or some tea or some lemonade out of the kitchen, and Pawpaw wanted us to fulfill those needs, but Pawpaw did not want to hear much of what we had to say. There was something that was stressing and straining, perhaps about the microaggressions in the kitchens in Highland Park cafeteria. Maybe there was something that he was wrestling with from dealing with having been a man of war. Maybe he was still processing things in the context of his psyche and his own well-being, but he needed some silence. Support, but silence. Wasn't mean. I just knew that Pawpaw needed some space. But over time, I thought he popularized this phrase. I didn't know that something that came to be pejorative over time could have come from other places. While Pawpaw was no saint, I would have never thought that it was actually the church who offered into the lexicon of American idealism, who offered into the context of Western thought the idea that children should be seen and not heard. But it was. Around 1450, a clergyman by the name of John Merck, in a list of sermons or homilies that was produced around 1450 in a officio called Merck's Officio, in Old English language, centered this thought, that a maid should be seen but not heard. In its original form, it was specifically young women who were expected to keep quiet. This opinion is recorded in the 15th century collection of these homilies written by this clergyman, but while the expression was originally aimed at young women, the Old English names denoting gender are now somewhat altered. Maid was normally a young female, usually unmarried, although it also was used to denote celibate men. Girls, however, could be of either sex, the term simply meaning young child. And so I come with apology to Pawpaw, with understanding and appropriately aiming my attention at the church, who has offered to all of society, particularly Western society, that there is something in secondary status for children. If there is somehow a rightness in their silence, even in the midst of their pain. And perhaps this is one of the offerings to America and one of the offerings to Western society that we as the church have given, but cannot be rightly called a gift. Perhaps this is why children are seen and not heard in America. Seen and not heard, even though children make up the largest segment of the American population, largest generation in American life under the age of 18. Seen, how could we miss them? They are the most diverse generation in American history, with the majority of them being children of color. The majority of children under the age of 5 have been children of color since 2014. How could we miss them? 71% of them who live in poverty, the 1 in 7 who live in poverty, 71% are children of color. How could we miss them? They are everywhere. There's more of them than there are of us. Some of you are threatened by that. Some of you take it as a promise. Seen all over, seen in schools, seen as we wrestle with the challenges of our society, but not heard, without vote, without voice, without lobbyists, seen but not heard. And perhaps when one is seen and not heard, we may not be surprised by the fact that we've got just a couple of options. Children are either objectified or ignored. Objectified, made of a thing, to be used in the context of conversation and political debate to create or to gain points. A thing, an object in the conversation about appropriate public education being taught so that people might actually understand the realities of history in their accurate form, with various cultures being fully represented. A thing, for points to be scored, or to be considered only worthy if one works or one's parents works. Objectified, and when one is objectified, it is much easier for one to be marginalized. Objectified by some and ignored by others. Ignored as if they do not exist because they can't write checks. Ignored as if they do not exist because they should not have vote. Ignored because they have not yet come through confirmation. I'm sorry, we were talking about America. But inasmuch as children are seen and not heard in public policy, they also get lost in congregational polity. What would it mean? And what might happen? What would it sound like if we listened to children? I'm glad that those of us who give into the text don't have to imagine this. In the context of the reading in Mark's Gospel in chapter 10, we actually have a conversation between Jesus and a couple of children. I know we have been, in the context of public and congregational narrative and ecclesiastical history, we have been disabused of accurate history. We see these pictures of disciples with long beards walking with Jesus, who seems to himself be an older man than he actually was at the time. But those of you who come oh so committed, oh so valiantly, oh so studiously to Bible study, you all already know that the development of religious education for young people began. They began to follow away a rabbi at about the age of 12 or 13. You know that when the disciples go with Jesus into the temple to offer sacrifice, that even though all of them come, they only offer sacrifice that is worthy of 2 adults. You know, because Peter is the one who's married, that he's the only one who is actually of adult age. You know that Jesus was a youth pastor. And these disciples, James and John, who come to him with this inquiry, are just teenagers. They are those in the youth choir we just heard, seeking to have a dialogue with Jesus. And thus, you know that each time we see Jesus in conversation with those disciples, he's actually listening to children. Because we see him most intimately with them, we recognize that he has placed the hopes of all his work on them. What would happen if we listen to children? I want to suggest that if we listen to children, we might do what Jesus did. If we listen to children, we might be able to raise a nation, to craft a people, to live an ethic and even an ideal. And for those of us, in the American context, we might even be able to do what that poet who made his way, like I did, from Missouri to New York, told us we need to do. The making of a nation is really about making real the idea, the myth, the oath, the concept of America that has not yet been. Langston Hughes, perhaps between his stanzas and refrain in Let America Be America Again, perhaps we hear the voices of children seeking to enter in. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself can be free. And where are the children saying, America never was America to me? Let America be the dream, the dreamer's dream. Let it be that great strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriot wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in the homeland of the free. He goes further and goes along. I invite you to read it yourself, but as I come to this close, he suggests that he is sure. Call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from these who live, these like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be out of the rack and ruin of gangster death, the rape of rot and graft and stealth and lies. We, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America not great, just America again. The offering is that the making of a nation, the raising thereof, is reliant upon those in the parentheses between the stanzas, for whom America never was America. America never was a place where we had voice. America never was a place where we had vote. And this is most accurately pointed to our children. And so I say today, for those who seek to rebuild America, that it is not, even in this moment where we see post-January 6th, that democracy is in peril, even in this moment where we see institutions of democracy fail, that this is not about reform, it is not about renewal, it is not about revival, it is not about America being what America once was. Rather, it is about raising America for the first time, to live out the ideal. And I offer that this generation, those who reflect the opportunity to have the first multicultural democracy on the face of the earth fully functioning, because their demographics say so, and their destiny perhaps would will so, and they are so committed that they won't wait for it, that they may reflect for us what the disciples represented for Jesus. Jesus, earlier in this chapter, in the midst of desperate parents and misled disciples, suggests and places his hopes for the kingdom on children. Why would Jesus do that? I offer that Jesus does it for some of the things we see in this text. First, Jesus does it because young people demonstrate the audacity to aspire. Most of the time when I grew up listening to this text, I heard preachers who were older than these disciples. I heard grown-ups who had votes. I heard people who had standing and status and voice in systems absolutely get upset and absolutely try to look down upon John and James for asking for what they wanted. Oh, the privilege of people who know they're going to get a turn to speak. Oh, the privilege of those who know that they have a vote. Oh, the privilege of preachers who get to stand up and have a microphone and have everybody listen to them. To say that these two disciples, these two teenagers coming like my 13-year-old and my 16-year-old around the table saying, hey, we heard what you had said earlier. I'm sorry, that's poor, that's colloquial English. We have a sense that you're about to establish your kingdom. We understand that you just shared a word about your sacrifice. We believe as you prepare for this great confrontation that this thing that we've been following you for a couple of years is about to come into being, and we have trust and belief that you are going to take on authority. And we desire when you come into your kingdom that we will be on your right and your left side. I've heard people who look at these teenagers and seek to talk down to them because they are seeking authority in the context of a coming kingdom. And I see two of my sons sitting there saying, Daddy, you are building something that we believe is worth something, and when it happens, we want to take a part in it, and we want to have not just position, we want to have responsibility, and we want to have authority. Quite frankly, it feels like every major movement in the context of the face of the globe, which has been led by young people, in the context of the Ferguson uprising, those were those who were under the age of 30. At Tiananmen Square, it was young people standing in front of tanks. Every major movement that we have known has been led by young people. So the audacity to aspire for something greater, the audacity to aspire for authority in that which is next, that is the legacy that is indeed which comes to young people. And so they're not wrong, they're right on. And thanks be to God for those who aspire to authority, and thanks be to God to those who stand up into systems and speak to power to say, as it comes, we ought to have a place, and we ought to have a position, and we ought to have a voice. This is what these young people are doing. They are demonstrating the audacity to aspire even when others would not have them to speak up, even when preachers would speak against them. And Jesus responds interestingly as they demonstrate the audacity to aspire. Even despite their elements of ignorance, Jesus affirms their agency. Jesus says, kind of like Jesus often does, he asks them a question. Are you willing to drink of the cup that I drink of? Are you willing to be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? And they say, yes, we're able. And Jesus affirms their agency. He says, yes, you will. Yet there's a thing that I can't quite give. I want to, even before we get to Jesus, note that Mark, I call Mark the OG, the original gospel. Mark does something that Matthew does not. Mark puts the words of assessment, the words of aspiration in the mouths of these teenagers. Matthew, in the 20th chapter, rather has their mother coming in to speak for them. Mark has them standing, speaking to the Almighty, to the Savior of the world themselves. The affirmation of their agency comes through in the telling of the story, but also in Jesus' response. Jesus teaches by listening. Several episodes in chapter 10, people come to Jesus with questions or with problems, and he responds not first with an answer, but with a question. Those of us who want to teach children, lead youth, advocate for their well-being, must have the humility and commitment to pause before we speak and ask them a few questions. What would it sound like? What would it feel like if our public policies, our congregational ministries, indeed even our freedom theologies began with listening to children? Conversations about their needs, yes. Conversations about their pains, yes. Conversations about their hopes, yes. But also conversations about their capacities, their competencies, their credentials. These children and these youth have capacities and competencies to save the whole world. You may not believe it, but Jesus did. Earlier in the same chapter, he declared to this group, suffer the little children to come unto me and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. But then he goes further. If you do not enter the kingdom as a child, then you can't come. you shall not enter in. Jesus affirms their agency. He does this work of saying, yes, you have a space and a place, but Jesus also limits himself so that something about God may be shown. Inasmuch as they demonstrate audacity to aspire and Jesus affirms their agency, we see by Jesus' own self-limitation that God is active in advancing their authority. What does he say simply? Yes, you will drink the cup. Yes, you will be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but the positions that you ask for are not mine to give. Rather, they are for those for whom it has already been prepared. I took this in the spirit of those who taught me this text to be Jesus saying, take your mind off of position and think about the work. I read that portion that comes in the 41st to the 45th verse as a redirection towards service. But I missed something when I rushed to that passage about service that I think is active about God in this text. If Jesus is self-limiting and Jesus does not say that they cannot go, that they cannot be on his right and his left, Jesus is deferring activity for another divine figure. Jesus perhaps sees that they do have authority. I argue always that the moral authority to define the future belongs with those who will live in it the longest. And so these children do have authority in this future, as do ours. And Jesus is not suggesting that they won't have position. Rather, Jesus is suggesting that someone else will be the one to determine who has position. That someone else I believe to be the creator God's self. I believe to be the mother and father God. And I am excited about that part because it means that God's self, will return to the posture that God had in creation. That God doesn't desire to be a prime mover and sit back and watch stuff happen. But God will return to the posture of crouched over in to get God's fingers dirty in the dirt. The God who shaped humanity as Adonai and from clay is the God who will reach down and advance young people who seek authority. The God who wasn't scared to get in with humanity and to make things happen is the God who is still hanging with humanity in order to advance the well-being of our children. The God who heard them when they spoke this is the God who will make sure that they will advance at the next level. And so while I get concerned about the well-being of children very often, I found hope and joy that God is active in the advancement, God will be active in the ascendance, and God will be active in the elevation of children to positions of authority in some of the places where there are some grown folks that frankly I can't stand. God is active in advancing their authority. God will make sure that their well-being comes forth. God will assure that their voices are heard. And God will do this even in the face of adults who do not know what to do. There was a time, very much like this one, where church folk gathered, didn't know what to do. For 10 years in St. Louis, I had the responsibility as the pastor of St. John's Church to care for the final resting place of a clergyman by the name of the Reverend Louis Nolau. Reverend Louis Nolau was a German immigrant, came to the United States seeking his face, setting his face toward Oregon in order to do ministry there on the margins, there at the edges of society. He thought that he wanted to build ministry there, and he made it about halfway. He ended up settling in St. Louis, serving as pastor of St. Peter's Church and a sister church to St. John's, where I pastored over the years. He came to find his final resting place in the pastor circle at St. John's Cemetery. And so seeing him there in that revered place, I thought I should learn his story. As he pastored St. Peter's, I am reminded of a time where just 2 generations after a major flu epidemic, where St. Louis had shown the world that if you mask and social distance, you can make it through this. That was in 1918 and 1920, but just a few years later in the 1950s, there was a cholera epidemic that began to take families or take parents away from children, that began to break up families and leave orphans like the 140,000 children who have lost a parent or a secondary caregiver in the context of COVID-19. And the church was trying to figure out what to do about this breaking of the family and the loss of these children. And trying to be a good pastor, Louis Nolau gathered the congregation together because young people were coming to the church to have their needs met. They had lost these children, and there they began to ask what the church was going to do. And the pastor came to the congregation and asked, "What shall we do?" He presented the idea of beginning an orphan's home for these children who have been locked out and left out by a pandemic and the politics of a society that still had German immigrants on the margins. They were still wrestling what it meant to be immigrants because they had not been grafted yet into the remuneration of whiteness in St. Louis society. They were just immigrants, first generation, many of them not speaking the language, many of them, they did not have the resources, and this is, as church counselors do, what they told the pastor. We don't have the resources to start an orphan's home. We know that we're given to the ministry of reconciliation, but $3.5 trillion seems too much. We don't have the knowledge to meet all of their needs. We don't have the space in this august building in order to serve them. We don't have the stuff that it takes to wrestle with the challenges of these children. And Reverend Nolau had only one answer. He says, "Yes, but we have the children. We may not know what to do, yes, but we have the children. We may not have all the answers, yes, but we have the children. We may not believe that $3.5 trillion is enough money and that we have it, yes, but we have the children. We may not have a plan for vaccination to fully return to society, yes, but we have the children. And as long as we have God and we have the willingness to listen to them through Him, listen to Him through them, listen to her Spirit move in the voices of the choirs that have sung with us today, then we have everything we need. How will we meet the needs? We will listen to the children. It feels like the day is dark and we do not have to have all the answers. We believe that God speaks through humanity, and as we affirm the full humanity of the 74 million souls reliant upon us, we have all that we need. You may not feel that you have enough. Yes, but we have the children. And as long as God has us, then they will be well as we work and walk with God. God bless you and God keep you is my prayer.